Morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the Associate Director of Science and Chief Scientist here at Natural History Museum. Well, welcome to the first of our 2020 Big Ideas presentations. Firstly, I'd like to welcome those of our board who have been able to join us today, and I'd also like to welcome our staff. I can see many of you jumping on the line. I would like to mention that we're recording this video so that you can come back and view it at a later time, and we plan to make this available on the Darwin site. Well, I'm very new to the Big Ideas process, but I've seen the result of many of our previous Big Ideas either in the galleries or through some of the brilliant research projects such as Recovering Voices, the Human Origins Research Project and Gallery, Deep Time, and also the Global Genome Initiative. So we have a great legacy, and it's really exciting to hear from our mineral sciences team today on what they've been doing for about the last year in planning for this big idea. We've had a lot of feedback already, but we really would welcome your feedback today and into the future as you have time to think about this presentation. We have a Q&A section where we will take questions. So have a look down the bottom right-hand side of your screen to see Q&A. And Dr. Liz Cottrell will be coordinating those questions at the end of the presentations. The presentation will go for about 35 minutes, and you'll have the opportunity to have a look through those questions and upvote them if there's one, if your question has already been asked. So please feel free to be interactive. I am really excited for this presentation. I know a huge amount of work has gone into this from the Mineral Sciences team. And I am now going to hand over to Dr. Tim McCoy, who is the Department Chair for Mineral Sciences and also one of our curators for meteorites. Please, Tim, take it ahead, take it over.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mike, if you can bring up the slides. So this past summer saw unprecedented interest in the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 and this iconic footprint on the moon, the first time humans had set foot on another world. In the 50 years since then, we've explored every planet in the solar system from Mercury to Pluto, depending on whether you're in the pro-planet or anti-planet camp for Pluto. And we've even sent rovers to other planets, to Mars, to look for evidence of past habitable environments and past life. We've even peered beyond our solar system to discover planets around other stars, taking literally millions, perhaps billions of images and pieces of data during those 5 decades of exploration. Yet the most important image ever taken in space wasn't taken during those 50 years. It was taken about 8 months before Apollo 11. We could have the next slide, Mike. When the astronauts of Apollo 8 orbiting the moon emerged from the far side of the moon to capture this image, the Earth rising above the moon in the blackness of space. And this image really captured how unique our planet is. And in 3 important ways: the ocean that covers about 3/4 of the Earth's surface, the continents, the silica-rich continents that literally rise above the oceans, and the abundance of life that teems on both the continents and within the oceans. And so our unique planet is really designed to look at 3 important questions, very simple questions. What is the source of water for the oceans? How did those continents, those silica-rich continents, first form? And how did minerals serve as a template for life? Next slide. Now, these questions aren't new. So why now? Because we have key samples available for the first time. Our team has scoured the globe from the Aleutian Islands. This is Liz Cottrell, lifted in by helicopter to the Aleutians to study the incubators of modern silica-rich continents, to the Jack Hills of Australia, where Mike Ackerson has studied the oldest minerals on Earth. But sometimes we can't even find what we're looking for on this planet. It's been wiped out from the surface. So we have to go into space. This is the asteroid Bennu in the lower left, which we are currently orbiting and will soon sample to get samples of the material that made up our planet. Next. So what are we going to actually do? Well, you may not know it, but the oceans have a fingerprint, a chemical fingerprint. And that's the ratio of hydrogen to its isotope deuterium. And every drop of water in the ocean shares that fingerprint. So wherever that water came from, whether erupted from a volcano or delivered from outer space, it has to have that matching fingerprint of deuterium to hydrogen. And we know that water was present when the first continents formed. The grain in the upper right is a zircon grain, 4.3 billion years old, the oldest mineral grains on Earth. And these grains had to form in the presence of water in silica-rich and granitic rocks. And it's not surprisingly that those granites weather to clays. Clays are outstanding at producing energy and environments for the organization of early organics. So perhaps it's not surprising that if you look at the lower image, this is a cyanobacteria, and around its margins, it's actually precipitating clay. And so how did minerals serve as a template for life? Next slide. Well, once we know all of this information, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to share it? Well, we're going to share it in person in places like Curious. We're going to share it online through things like our award-winning Science How broadcast. And we're going to build a time machine. Now, it's really hard to find a DeLorean that'll still hit 88 miles per hour. So we're going to build a virtual time machine, something that can transport the user back to the earliest Earth, a place that in many ways is very similar to Earth, and in many ways is so different, to understand how much our planet has changed and how unique our planet really is. Next slide. And how is this going to change our museum and our audience? Well, since the opening of the Air and Space Museum in 1976, our museum has really seeded the place that you go to understand it as a planet. Sure, we do a great job explaining the parts of our planet: volcanoes, mammals, dinosaurs. But the problems we face, the challenges we face as a society are planetary in scale. And so we want to package all that back up and reclaim NMNH's role, along with the Air and Space Museum, in explaining our planet as a system. And to do that, we have to bridge the divides between space and Earth, the divides between oceans and life. We have to repackage all that. And this is going to set the stage in the next decade for a new exhibit, perhaps a renovation of the Geology, Gems, and Mineral Hall, perhaps another exhibit that would trace the history of our planet from nucleosynthesis all the way to the origin of life. Next. Why NMNH? Well, we've talked about some of this. We have the key people. This is Liz and the Aleutians. This is me with the model, actually a working model of the Mars rovers that I worked on for 5 years. We have the key samples, both from Earth and space. And we have key laboratories to study these samples. But none of this is really worth anything, next, without the key questions. It's those questions that we're driving towards. And so we've really envisioned this in 2 phases. And they're sort of like science fiction movies. Phase 1, we call It Came From Within. And in phase 2, it came from outer space. So the first phase is really looking at the Earth from the Earth perspective. And we ask questions like, how is modern biomineralization tied to early Earth mineral life interactions? Did gases erupted during volcanic activity in the past have the right chemistry to form the oceans? And if so, when did that occur? And how are incubators of silica-rich volcanism forming continent-like rocks today? And how did that happen for the first time on the early Earth? In that second phase, we really look at the planet from outside the planet, from the perspective of space. So how did minerals serve as templates for organic molecules and help spark life on early Earth? Did the water delivered to Earth by asteroids help form the oceans? And what processes occurred deep within the Earth and perhaps on the Moon or Venus to form those first silica-rich continents? So what we want to do for most of this presentation is take a deep dive into the science. How are we going to actually do this? And you're going to hear from all of my colleagues and partners on our unique planet to actually answer these questions. Next.
So on the minerals life interaction front, our big question is, how did minerals serve as templates for life? But first, in phase 1 of our unique planet, we focus on the investigation of modern biomineralization, which is the formation of minerals by organisms And we do that in order to glean insights that can help in understanding early Earth interactions between life and minerals. So on the right, you see a stromatolite, which is a rock that holds the first evidence of life on Earth. These are fossilized microbial mats produced by cyanobacteria. Most modern microbial biomineralizers, including the cyanobacteria that you see, produce minerals outside their cell by inducing changes in the chemistry of their environment. So we call this induced biomineralization. Stromatolites are typically carbonate rocks, but what we are finding is that cyanobacteria initially mediate the formation of clay biominerals, which may later be replaced by carbonates. So with this new insight, we can ask the following questions. How did induced biomineralization operate in the past or in other places, like Mars, for example? Do we need to revise our models of stromatolite formation? And do we need to look for unconventional biomarkers, such as clay minerals? Next, please. One very special group of microorganisms, magnetotactic bacteria, produce minerals using a genetic template. We call this templated biomineralization. So this is a parallel mechanism to induced biomineralization, which you saw on the previous slide. Magnetotactic bacteria produce iron biominerals inside the cell via specialized genes that control particle size, shape, arrangement, crystallography, chemistry, etc. So they're pretty remarkable organisms. And understanding modern magnetotactic bacteria can shed light on the evolution of templated biomineralization, which we also see in higher organisms, such as ourselves. With the help of genomic studies, we know that some of these microorganisms appeared as early as 3.5 billion years ago, so are likely candidates for the first life form to employ templated biomineralization. Thus, fundamental questions that we aim to answer are, how did templated biomineralization appear? How did it evolve? Did biomineralization in higher organisms evolve from one primordial mechanism, or did it evolve many times over in Earth's history? Next.
In modern examples of higher organisms, we see many ways in which life templates biominerals in the form of shells, skeletons, and bones, in organisms such as corals, mollusks, and even us humans. And in many cases, biominerals form through non-traditional crystallization pathways that require particular proteins or even other organic molecules to specifically template mineral shapes. For instance, the pearl nacre that's imaged here can form these tiny tablets of the mineral aragonite, thanks to proteins and chitin templates. And next. As we've been observing how life is actively involved in templating minerals during modern times, in phase 2 of our big idea, we will explore how minerals may have been critical in templating early life. Next.
So moving from the micro scale to the macro scale, what you're looking at here is an eruption of Colima volcano in Mexico in 2007. And it is no coincidence that the same components that drive volcanoes to be explosive, that drive eruptions, water, carbon dioxide, are those same compounds that give Earth its unique atmosphere. And that's because it is the atmosphere of the planet is generated from outgassing of Earth's mantle, the solid, rocky mantle of the planet. And so we ask, did the gases erupting during volcanic activity in the past have the chemistry to form the Earth's oceans and atmosphere? And if so, when did that occur? Next. The atmosphere of Earth is essentially a tipping point on the planet. Very small changes in the composition of Earth's mantle. That's the bulk composition of the planet and the identity and compositions of the minerals in Earth's mantle, specifically the oxygen content, determine if we will have the life-giving atmosphere that we have today. It's the composition of Earth's interior that determines that volcanoes will outgas carbon dioxide and water, which are life enabling versus poisonous carbon monoxide or explosive hydrogen gas. Next. And this unique atmosphere that we have wasn't always so. For the first half of Earth's history, Earth's atmosphere did not have any oxygen. It wasn't until the Great Oxidation Event, which has to be one of the top 5 events in all of Earth's history, 2.5 billion years ago, that our atmosphere had oxygen. Was this fundamental shift in the course of Earth's history due to a fundamental shift in the properties of Earth's interior, the temperature of the mantle or the composition of the mantle? At the museum, we're well poised to answer this question. Next. We can go back in time by looking at rocks erupting today that sample ancient mantle to look for clues. So for example, how does the oxygen content of mantle melts that remember Earth's early days, more than 2.5 billion years ago, how does it differ from modern mantle melts? And what about the carbon and water concentrations of those same melts? What do they tell us about the cosmochemical origin of that ancient mantle? Where in the solar system or universe it was delivered from, and when? In the Department of Mineral Sciences, we're well poised to answer these questions. Next. And on a related front, we also are poised to answer one of the most fundamental questions in Earth science, which is, how do continents form? This is a critical aspect of what makes our planet unique. Earth is the only planet that we know of that has continental crust, that has high-standing ancient continents. We know that it's the mantle's oxygen and water contents that are critical to the formation of continents. And we want to look back in time, but most continent on Earth was generated more than 3 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago. We can look, however, in very unique places on the planet where continental crust is being created today, such as the Western Aleutians. That's the image that you're seeing here out in the Bering Sea. We can go and sample the rocks there to learn about the mantle beneath this nascent continental crust. Next. And so ultimately we want to understand, is the mantle beneath this nascent continental crust fundamentally different from mantle elsewhere in terms of its oxygen and water contents? This is going to require new laboratory experiments, new samples, and new measurements, all of which we are well positioned to do at the museum. Next.
The modern continental crust is composed of plutonic or granitic rocks, and volcanoes are the surface expressions of those large bodies of intrusive magmatic rocks. Volcanoes are formed by eruption of magma that leaks or escapes from the larger intrusive system. Next slide. The volatile species within magmas, especially water, exert enormous controls on mineral stabilities, magma properties such as melt viscosity and magma rheology, and ultimately on the eruption style. This means that most volcanic eruptions are driven by volatiles exalting to form bubbles, and iconic volcanoes and their eruptions, such as St. Helens in Washington State, are driven by water. Next slide. The image on the left shows a polished thin section of rock from El Chichon volcano in Mexico. And just as tree rings provide records of environmental conditions, the minerals in this rock and their compositions and textures record pre-eruptive magma conditions through time. For example, the brown amphiboles in the middle of this slide indicate that the magma had at least 4 weight % water and a temperature less than 875 Celsius prior to eruption. However, zoning within those crystals shows that on at least one occasion, the magma was heated sufficiently to partly dissolve the amphiboles before returning back to amphibole stability. And we can analyze groups of crystals and all of their zoning patterns to infer changes in magma conditions through time. Next. Although we cannot travel to magma pressures and temperatures to directly observe magmas, we can make magma in experimental laboratories within the department. Our facilities cover a range of pressure temperature conditions that span from the core mantle boundary all the way through the crust and even into outer space. Importantly, we can conduct both static experiments as well as dynamic experiments to determine various rates of processes. Next slide. We can then compare our experimental samples, which were conducted at known conditions or at known rates, with natural samples to determine the conditions that form the natural rocks. This thus enables us to understand magma processes that form the continental crust. Next.
Now, one of the major questions we want to address in phase one of this big ideas proposal is, how did the Earth's first continents form? And the approaches that Liz and Ben just described are great for understanding how continental rocks form today and into the relatively shallow past. But unlike today, where we can walk on the flanks of active volcanoes, the further back we go in time, the less material we have available for study. And if we go back to the earliest known pieces of Earth, they're actually pieces of ancient continental crust, except all that's left are tiny crystals of zircons, which are about the width of a couple human hairs. And the two images I'm showing here are zircons from the Jack Hills of Western Australia. And these images were taken on the Electron microprobe in the Department of Mineral Sciences. And in particular, the zircon on the right is 4.31 billion years old. And we can use the chemistry of these zircons to understand how ancient magmas formed. However, our ability to understand these systems, as Liz said, is critically contingent upon our ability to understand how modern magnetic systems. Hence, the work that Liz and Ben described is critical for us to understand and interpret ancient rocks. And while the Jack Hills holds the oldest known Earth material, there are plenty of other ancient rocks on the planet. And the two red stars I'm showing here are locations of ancient rocks that we currently have within the collections and in the Department of Mineral Sciences. But all the gray rocks on this map are rocks that are older than 2.5 billion years. And you can imagine that each one of these individual rocks is a snapshot in time and place. And through collecting and analyzing rocks from across the globe in time and space, we can then use them to reconstruct the evolution of Earth's continents through time. And one of the major goals of this phase one of our proposal is to do strategic fieldwork in conjunction with sample donations to create a temporally and geographically comprehensive catalog of ancient crustal rocks. This catalog will hold 96% of Earth's history, and it'll be critical for us in answering and addressing the questions we've outlined here, but importantly, it'll also be useful for researchers across the globe, both today and well into the future. And ultimately, what we want to do with all this information is to reconstruct how the Earth's continents formed and evolved over time. Now, if we go all the way back to the earliest Earth, around 4.5 billion years ago, we know that the Earth was most likely a hot molten ball with a core and a mantle beginning to form. We also know, thanks to the Jack Hill zircons, that relatively soon after that, around 4.4 billion years ago, we had continental crust that was made of granites, and we had liquid water oceans. Now, those liquid water oceans and continents were likely much different from those which we have today. So with this catalog of ancient rocks, we're going to try to address the questions of, when did modern style plate tectonics start? How did the volatiles evolve in the crust and mantle? And with these continental rocks, we can actually start to address questions like, when do we see evidence for the timing and emergence of life?
You noticed early on that we described phase one and phase two. It's rare in science that you have a single moment that defines when science will change, but we have such a moment. In the upper left, you'll see an image of the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft. I've been working on this mission for 15 years, and on October 20th of this year, we're going to kiss the surface of an asteroid. Literally, after a journey of billions of miles, we're going to touch the surface of the asteroid for 5 seconds. And in that 5 seconds, we're going to collect some of this rocky rubble. You can see in the center animated GIF our match point exercise where we hovered over the surface of where we're going to sample. This is still about 65 meters above the surface. And when we touch that, the sampling head in the lower right is going to basically blow air in there. You might think of it as a vacuum, but it's actually the exact opposite of a vacuum. When we designed this, we called it MUCAV for a while, which is vacuum backwards, because it blows air in and it fluidizes the regolith and catches it in this annular ring. That little sampling disk and its protective cushion is the only part of the spacecraft that will return to Earth. And that's going to happen in 2023. And that sample, rich in water, rich in prebiotic organics that led to the origin of life, is going to kick off phase 2 of our project. Next. And when we get this sample back, we're going to throw everything we have at it. So we want to know about its minerals. So in the upper left, you'll see our scanning electron microscope, which can tell us about the chemistry of minerals, the presence, the textures. Our electron microprobe, a relatively new $1.5 million electron microprobe in the lower left, will be used to measure the precise compositions of those minerals. In the upper right is our Raman spectrometer, which can tell us more about minerals, but it can also tell us about inorganic carbon. So for example, the forms of graphite in here. And an instrument that we have in collaboration with the Jet Propulsion Lab in the lower right, the time of flight secondary ion mass spectrometer, can tell us about the entire range of chemical compositions. And we've been using these instruments for decades to study these. Next. So for example, these are images taken from the Murchison meteorite. Now Murchison in meteoritics field, this meteorite fell surprisingly in 1969, only a couple of months after Apollo 11. And it is the gold standard for understanding organics. More than 140,000 organic species have been found in here. But these instruments allow us to do things like compare inorganic elements like sodium, aluminum, potassium, calcium across the top with organics, these sums of this complex organics, which are really fragments of amino acids, carboxylic acids, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. We call those PAHs. And we can relate those to the minerals. For example, the optical image where you see these different minerals. So with these instruments, we can directly measure whether certain organics are associated with certain minerals, whether they serve as templates for those organics in organizing those. Next slide.
Our current analytical SEM is getting old and less reliable, so we've been looking into replacing it. This gives us the opportunity to expand our analytical capabilities in ways that'll help meet the goals of our unique planet. Here you see a slide of an SEM platform showing a number of possible options. Things in blue would be new capabilities for our lab. We'll go around it counterclockwise, starting up at 1 o'clock. Scanning electron microscopes continue to become more versatile in their operating conditions, while at the same time retaining nanometer and smaller imaging resolution. One new capability we will be considering in the SEM column will be the environmental SEM mode, which allows direct observation of wet samples such as cyanobacteria, fungi, and other biological samples. On the left, the wavelength spectrometer and micro XRF would give us high quality quantitative analyses at the major and minor and trace element levels respectively. Twin EDS detectors will improve analysis and elemental mapping and analysis of unprepared grains, say like from an asteroid. 2 detectors will also increase throughput dramatically. Electron backscatter diffraction reveals mineral crystallographic orientations in rocks and can aid in mineral identification. A focused ion beam column can be used for depth profiling and milling of thin wafers for examination in transmission microscopy, for example, using the scanning transmission electron detector that we have today. Cathodoluminescence detection can reveal highly detailed growth features like you saw in Mike's slide, and other details in minerals that provide guidance for analytical work. Being able to make these observations in a new mode, low vac mode, would be a very useful new capability. Next.
So we've heard from Tim about minerals as a template for life on asteroids, but what about on Earth? In the middle diagram here, you see a bunch of origin of life models. And the ones that pertain to minerals are the ones on the right, the thermal vent world and the clay world models. In the clay world model, clays provide millions of reaction chambers in which complex organic molecules are assembled by wetting and drying cycles. So the hypothesis to be tested here is clay minerals acted as early genetic materials and formed templates for organic molecules.
The other hypothesis for early life arising thanks to mineral templates is called the hydrothermal vent world. As hydrothermal fluids from deep sea vents hits ocean water, minerals are precipitated, and the chemical redox gradients that occur at these interfaces may have led to the development of early chemosynthetic life. Next.
We're going to switch gears here a little bit and go back to talking about Earth's water and the sources of Earth's water, and particularly with the respect to the deuterium to hydrogen ratio that Tim mentioned earlier on that is so diagnostic for Earth's water. And so when most people think about the extraterrestrial sources of water and what would have delivered water to Earth early on, they think of icy, wet comets coming in and depositing that water. But it turns out that we've actually measured the D to H ratios of a large array of materials in our solar system. And of all of the comets that we've measured, only 1 or 2 have the same D to H ratio as Earth. And you can see Earth's blue line is that horizontal blue line crossing through the middle of your diagram. And Earth is the big diamond on the left. And all of those comets lie above that D to H ratio. However, more promising are the asteroids, which you can see over on the left in the gray diamonds, and about half of those measurements actually have an overlap with the Earth's D to H ratio, which is really exciting. The problem is that we don't have very many measurements of D to H ratios in asteroids, and those measurements are actually made within meteorites. So that's where we come in. This is really fortunate for us because we have a very large meteorite collection at the museum, as you know, and we can help to build this library of D to H ratio measurements within meteorites and for the asteroids. Next, please. So that's exactly what we intend to do. In phase 1, we'll look through these meteorites and figure out which ones we want to analyze. And in phase 2, we will start to build up the numbers of D to H ratio measurements that we have in a wide array of different types of meteorites, but also particularly focusing on meteorites that span the range of degrees of aqueous alteration, so alteration by water. Because what you may not know is that meteorites, many of these meteorites were actually really altered on their parent asteroids before they came to Earth by water. And as you can see, the meteorite in the images at the top, that's actually a thin section slice of a meteorite where all of the minerals in it have been altered to clay minerals and some carbonate minerals. And then we can use these, some of these actually have up to 15 weight% water, and we can use this water to our advantage to measure the D to H ratios within that and start to try to build relationships between these different planetary bodies and try to answer where the water on Earth may have come from. Next.
Those measurements tell us where the water may have come from. We want to know when the water might have come. And so one way to do that is working with our colleague Scott Kenyon at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory to do what we call N-body simulation. So this is an N-body simulation. It was actually done by Sean Raymond out of the University of Washington in 2006. And it's a graph of semi-major axis. So that's the distance to the sun in astronomical units. 1 astronomical unit is the distance from the Earth to the sun, versus eccentricity, so how elongate the orbit is. So we're going to start these particles at 0 eccentricity in circular orbits. The big black dot is Jupiter. And you can see the ones closer to the sun are red, they have relatively little water. The ones further from the sun are blue, they have more water. And we're going to let these interact. Now, if the last time you thought about the asteroid belt was when you watched Han Solo fly through it, it may surprise you to know that this is not happening by collisions. It's happening by gravitational interaction. And you can see early on, the planet forming at about 1 AU is red, relatively poor in water. But as we let this evolve, the particles go to higher eccentricity, they become more elliptical, and they move inward. So by now, the object Earth is this sort of light blue, becoming more water rich. So these kinds of simulations, these N-body simulations, may allow us to answer where the planetesimals that made up Earth came from and when they reach our Earth. When did that water forming that ocean-forming water from outer space actually come to our planet. So these are really exciting ways to add a time component. Next. Now, if you're lucky enough to have granite countertops in your house, you probably have thought about continents from the sense of you have granite countertops. And if you lived on, say, Mercury, you wouldn't have granite countertops because there's no granite. But we think that on some of the other planets, for example, Venus on top has the tessera. You can see one up close on the upper right. That's Alpha Regio. They're these high-standing, highly tectonically faulted, deformed surfaces. And next to it, you can see these little round domes, these pancake domes. There is some idea that these actually formed by silicic volcanism very early in the history of the planet, not happening today. And the same thing may have happened on the moon. There are these rare domes. These are the Groothuysen domes in the lower left, Gamma and Delta. They don't look like much, but think about it. Each of these is about 30 kilometers across and about 1.5 kilometers high. So these are mountains, again, thought to be silica-rich material. So the same process that may have happened on early Earth may have happened on early Venus and the early moon, but been arrested in that process. And whatever that was didn't happen at the surface. It happened deep within those planets and moons to create silica-rich rocks. Next.
Well, with taking what we learned from part 1 about the evolution of the Earth's continents, we're going to use that data as inputs into large-scale geodynamic models. And the video I'm showing here is a numerical model of subduction and subducting plates on the modern Earth. And techniques like this utilize information gleaned from the rock record as a baseline for the modeling processes. So for example, using the ancient rock record, we can determine the extent of continental crust, the thickness of the continental crust, and its composition. And those fundamental parameters can be used as input parameters for these models. And then we can use these models to answer questions about the early Earth that we can't answer with the limited rock record, such as when could we have transitioned to plate tectonics? What was that style of plate tectonics? And importantly, why is Earth the only planet with plate tectonics like we know it?
So we want to end with these 3 questions about our unique planet. And just remind you, what is the source of water for the oceans? How did continents first form? And how did minerals serve as a template for life? That's what we're trying to learn. That's the structure we've built everything around, to answer those 3 questions. And with that, I want to thank you for joining our team to hear about our unique planet. And Liz Cottrell is now going to ask us some of your questions that we'll be happy to take for the remainder of the hour. Again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone who joined us today. We do have questions. Again, I just want to remind you that on the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a little Q&A with little bubbles above it. If you click that, you'll be able to type in your questions, and when you do, I'll be able to ask our panelists those questions. So you please use the Q&A function at the bottom there. Okay, so one of our questions is, who is leading the mission to collect samples of the asteroid? Tim, I'm going to give you that question. Who's leading the mission to collect the samples?
So the PI of the mission is Dante Loretta at the University of Arizona. It's an international team. There's probably, I don't know, 1,000 people working on this mission worldwide. And so each of us has a distinct role. Right now, my role in the orbital phase of the mission is to lead the geologic mapping of the asteroid. And I'm doing that with my postdoctoral fellow, Erica Jawan, who many of you saw give one of the lightning talks. And during the sample return phase of the mission, I will be leading the mineralogy petrology subteam for the larger particles, the centimeter-sized particles that we hope to collect. And so each of us has a role to play, and we work closely across that, again, led by the University of Arizona. Thanks.
Okay, our next question is coming from Kay, and I will leave this to Gabriella and Johan. How do you distinguish induced versus templated biomineralization?
Okay, I can start here and say that with modern organisms, you can actually find them together. And the templated biomineralization usually occurs inside the organism in case of microorganisms, and the induced outside. But if you don't have the life form itself, then you have to look at the minerals. And there are certain traits for minerals to distinguish them as being biogenic. So for example, in magnetite produced by magnetotactic bacteria, they have specific shapes and sizes and arrangements. They have chemical purity and crystallographic perfection. And I think Gabriela may say something about corals, which are higher organisms.
So we've actually been working on this question, both Johan and myself. So I look at corals, and we're actually looking at crystallographic signatures to be able to distinguish how a coral forms aragonite versus how, say, a pearl would form aragonite, and how they compare to geological analogs. So by using crystallography and chemistry, we can actually approach this question.
Okay, Rick Potts is asking, is plate tectonics a critical factor in forming continents, not just on Earth, but potentially on any planet? I'm going to answer that first, and then I'm going to pass the mic to Tim and Mike Ackerson, who might have different views. What I can say is that on Earth, continental style rocks and their formation are uniquely associated with subduction zones. So subduction is the process of old, dense, cold, oceanic plates, ocean crust, subducting or being recycled back down into Earth's interior, releasing its water to the mantle, which melts the mantle, and generating volcanoes in subduction zones. And the rocks that are erupted there, their chemistries are uniquely associated on Earth with the process of subduction and subduction zones. So there does seem to be an intimate relationship between the formation of continents and plate tectonics on Earth. But if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can add to that too. So yeah, what Liz is saying is certainly true. Another aspect of this is kind of a semantic question of how you define plate tectonics. So how most of us are defining it is as rigid plates, like Liz is describing, rigid plates moving against each other. But on the earliest Earth, where we had a really hot mantle and potentially very thin crust, we had tectonism, we had tectonic activity, but it wasn't like what we have today. So there's an idea called drip tectonics, where basically you can form drips of magma going into the mantle as opposed to rigid plates subducting. And that's one of the interesting aspects of using the continental rock record, because we can actually address this transition from drip tectonics through toward modern style plate tectonics on Earth. And I'll let Tim answer about other planetary bodies.
Yeah, I would just say what Mike talked about, drip tectonics, that's one model for how tectonics may have formed on Venus. But I think I want to go slightly aside too, because Mike talked about a hotter mantle. And this is one of the really exciting things when we talk about this virtual reality experience. Most of you have seen pictures of lava flows, these orange or reddish lava flows flowing across the surface of the planet. But if you think about it, in the early Earth, the mantle was so much hotter that in this virtual reality world, these lava flows would actually be blue. And so blue lava flows covering the surface of the planet. And that's the kind of thing that you have to think really differently about the planet in order to capture that and share that with the public. So these are all the questions we want to answer, and I think the ways we want to present them.
Okay, we have a bunch of other questions we want to get to. Is the amount, Lynn asks, is the amount of water on Earth finite? Carrie, do you want to take that one? Is the amount of water on Earth finite?
Is the amount of water on Earth finite? Well, other people can chime in on this too, but if you think about planets such as Mars that may have had water at one time and then lost its atmosphere, that, I mean, if in an all eventuality, that could be the kind of thing that could eventually happen to Earth down the line. So I think the answer to that is that water can probably escape from Earth, but we're probably not getting any more water. And anybody else wants to chime in on that, they're welcome to.
Maybe I could just add that, one of the interesting things about the Earth and the deep Earth and the Earth's mantle is that there's a lot of water actually locked in minerals in the Earth's mantle. And one of the interesting questions related to that is, how does that water get expressed at the surface? And that's a very complicated question. So, is Earth's water finite? Most likely, but we also have large reserves of that water in the mantle, but they're not reserves that are going to be coming to the surface, something that we could use anytime in the near future.
Yeah, I would just add, I think when we first started talking about this project, Liz mentioned that she didn't think asteroids were a potential source for water because the impact energies would be so high that you would lose that water. But we don't really understand completely that balance between delivery and loss of water. And, what are the sources coming in? How much water has to come in to offset any water that would be lost by an impact, and in what size impact? So those are the kind of questions I think we'll wrestle with over the next 5 years.
Next question is from Jackie Dixon. How will NMNH play a leadership role in coordinating the large academic and federal agency community involved in this field of research? And I'm just going to remind our panelists that we have many, many questions, so let's keep our answers as short as possible. Tim, I'll direct this one to you. How will play a leadership role at the museum in coordinating this with other federal agencies and academic institutions?
Yeah, I'll be brief. The leadership is really in the breadth of questions. There are lots of groups addressing one or two of these questions. We are uniquely placed to address all three of these questions. And just taking an example, the University of Arizona, which is a leadership role in this mission, they've separated their planetary science department from their geology department. So the groups that are addressing these different kinds of questions aren't working directly together. I sit and have lunch with Mike Ackerson and sit and have lunch with Yon and talk about these processes in a coordinated way. It's so integrated, you can't actually answer one without answering the others.
So next, Tina asks, you all seem to complement one another really well. Thanks, Tina. And make up a whole team. What are the key research areas or researchers you'd like to add to the team? I can start by saying that a key part of our proposal is to look for funding for postdoctoral fellows who can bring in expertise that we don't have, maybe not collections-focused researchers who you might want to keep for the duration of a federal appointment, but who can come in and tackle some of these questions where we lack the expertise in-house. Tim, do you have any follow-up to that quickly?
Exactly correct. We want to bring in a geodynamicist or someone who studies, microbes, who we might not hire in our department in a permanent position, but can help us really tackle these problems.
Gabriella, can we hear from you? What do you see as the greatest public informal science education opportunity or goals for this work? Public informal science education or goals, and anyone else could chime in too. I'm just picking on Gabriella here.
Well, recently I did participate in a Science How webcast, which was fantastic. And that was an informal setting where we were able to share the basics of biomineralization with the public. And I think that this big idea could really feed into that, where as we discover new things, we can be sharing this with the public via social media, via Science How, and eventually the time machine that Tim suggests. Anyone else?
We have a question from Paul Hagar, who asks, how would we tie an exhibit like this, like the one we're talking about in the decade after this initiative, to the Deep Time exhibit? Does this precede Deep Time? This enormously precedes Deep Time. This is Deep Time in this context is extremely shallow and essentially a yesterday moment relative to what we're talking about here. The Deep Time exhibit starts focusing around 250 million years ago. So.
Yeah, and Liz, I would just say we can actually take this further back with our colleagues at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. When people ask questions about where did we come from, you can start with the Big Bang, with nucleosynthesis, with the formation of elements, and follow that all the way to the first panel of Deep Time where life exists. early life exists and follow that entire process. So this could easily form sort of a precursor to deep time, both conceptually and perhaps even physically, if it were placed in the right part of the museum.
And Tim, you touched on this a little bit in your formal remarks. We have several questions about connections to NASEM and SAO through this project, and you just mentioned it again. So can you talk a little bit more about the plans for collaboration with other Smithsonian units?
Yeah, so this is not my first rodeo. This is my fifth spacecraft mission. I'm on my sixth one as well. And I've worked for decades with Tom Waters, Jim Zimbelman, John Grant, and Bruce Campbell over at the National Air and Space Museum on various missions and mission concepts. And so when we started talking about this, it was a natural link. And again, we are the curators of meteorites at the Smithsonian, but for years, the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory had a quite large and active meteorite group with Ursula Marvin and John Wood. And so reaching out to them was a natural extension. So this is really a pan-institutional proposal, and it could be scaled up pretty easily to look at our unique planet from this outside perspective, mostly in that phase 2 activity, and bringing in people who perhaps are less sample-oriented, but more model-oriented or remote sensing data. So it's just a natural fit, and one that, as I said, none of these are forced. These are people I've worked with for decades.
Another question we have is about data management plans for the instrument data. Are there external repositories, or does NMNH need to develop repositories? So I think there's this is specifically about data, not samples. Ben, are you able to chime in here?
Thank you. I think, answer part of this question. In terms of data that would be collected by our instruments at Natural History, at this point, there's no formalized data management plan, but that is something that we would be working on to formally develop. And that would include all analyses and images from the microprobe and SEM and X-ray CT scanner, all of those. And then as we move to extending those, there are certainly existing international repositories such as EarthChem that allow us to put in analyses into those fully accessible public databases. And for other analyses, I think Tim might be able to answer a little bit about how mission-oriented data would be curated.
Yeah, the mission-oriented data, both for remotely sensed data and for sample data, is going to be deposited in the planetary data system. And so we have a complete data plan. About 10% of the mission operating budget goes to data archiving. And so all of that will be available, because really when you get these samples, what we're going to learn in the short term is dwarfed by what we'll learn in the long term. And that's the beauty of samples, is they're the gift that keeps on giving. People will have these samples for decades to study with techniques we can't even envision right now.
Okay, we have related questions that we're going to get to next about the public, from several people asking related questions about why the general public would care about these questions and how their lives will change, and what are the most salient aspects of this project that we would want the public to take away. I'll throw something out there and then open it to the rest of the panelists. I do not think that the general public know about Earth's deepest past. I don't think the general public know that for the first half of Earth's history, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. I don't think that the public know that Earth is unique among the planets we know of for having continents and plate tectonics. And I think that inspiring this awe and wonder in the public is a fundamental goal for me. Just sparking that understanding, the blue marble that Tim opened his remarks with, of looking back on our planet and recognizing how unique our planet is, and wondering at that, and also recognizing how precious the forces are and how much the atmosphere and the surface of the planet has changed over the course of Earth's history, I think is of critical importance to the public. And I would open up to other panelists at this point.
Yeah, Liz, I'll chime in here. I think when we first started thinking about this was a real concern of ours. And We face enormous challenges as a society, and those challenges are planetary in scale. But I'm a firm believer that the best thing we can do at the museum is not tell people what to do, but it's the awe and wonder Liz talked about. And I think we need to leave people with that awe and wonder. I'll give you an example. I suspect if you looked around your house right now, and we've all been home a long time, you probably have a piece of your grandmother's china or, you know, something like that sitting in a cabinet somewhere. It's probably not the nicest thing in your home, but you take care of it because it's special to you. And we need people to take care of our planet because we need them to appreciate how unique and wonderful our planet is. That there is no other planet like this. There truly is no planet B. And we need to inspire them to want to take care of our unique planet.
Okay, Phil Recchio asks, do you anticipate the mantle models having any implications for current exoplanet research or exploration? Well, yeah, probably not exploration in our lifetimes, but exoplanet research. Will we be able to correlate Earth's planetary lessons to the rest of the universe? And I'm gonna send this to Mike Ackerson.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And it kind of touches on a lot of what all of us do. So, you know, with respect to the exoplanet research, we're getting a lot of interesting chemical data from these exoplanets, believe it or not. Things like magnesium silicon ratios of the planets. And we could use that with our understanding of how the Earth works itself. Magnesium silicon ratio is critical for the Earth's mantle. And we can use our basic models for these mantle convection on Earth and apply that with the information we have about the size and temperature and chemistry of those exoplanets to predict, you know, and to a certain extent, whether they would have plate tectonics. And I'd welcome any other comments from other panelists.
We have time for just one more question here. Is there any other research group or funding agency pursuing such an integrated approach to planetary biology? I would say yes. There are NASA centers and NSF facilities looking at this. Even within town, the Carnegie Institution for Science just up the road is working on this. So there are lots of places with whom we could partner to pursue this research. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, we have lots of people working on individual aspects on this and perhaps on some of them. But for example, you know, the people at Carnegie aren't deeply involved in the spacecraft missions right now that are collecting these samples. And it's really the samples are what are driving this. And I remember when I presented to the board, they said, well, what's your elevator pitch? And my elevator pitch is this. We've been looking for the needle in the haystack for 50 years to answer these questions. We've found it. And we can use the samples that we're getting now for the first time, these 4.3 billion-year-old zircons, these tephras that Liz collected in the Aleutians from these incubators, the minerals that are forming from life, these samples from outer space. We actually have the ability, I think for the first time in 50 years, to reach scientific consensus, to, as we will, answer at least one of these questions in the next 5 years. And I would just leave you with saying, you know, the reason for our unique planet is that we want to be involved in answering those questions, not just presenting the answers that others gain for those questions.
Thanks, Tim. I couldn't agree with those sentiments more. It is 10:59, and I'm going to hand things over to Rebecca Johnson to wrap up this session. Thank you so much to the museum community for joining us. Really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think we had 250 people joining us for this presentation. Tim made me promise not to mention the words brilliant geniuses or savants, but I think that the team has done such a wonderful job of demonstrating this super exciting journey that we're already on, from understanding our planet from within to understanding it from outside, through our samples, through our incredible scientific experts, and through the exciting collaborations that will be necessary to do this brilliant project. And like Tim and all of the team have said, we are uniquely placed to lead this project and bring in all of the important components to answer these really big questions. And importantly, perhaps even remind our visitors and the public and even other researchers that these are questions that we should be answering. And if they haven't thought about them before, to really open up their minds for what we might be able to share with them in the future to ensure that we value our planet into the future. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to the entire Mineral Sciences team for a brilliant presentation. And please continue to send your feedback. It's been so wonderful to hear from the community today. Thanks a lot. See you later.